Lieutenant Commander Thomas Reed had been serving as senior cultural liaison aboard the Asterian Royal Citadel for 8 months, which was long enough to understand that diplomatic emergency, in alien royal court terminology, usually meant either someone had accidentally violated ancient protocol, or actual interstellar war was about to break out due to translation errors. The emergency alert that woke him at 300 station time suggested today would involve both. "Read to Diplomatic Central," he said into his comm unit while pulling on his formal liaison uniform. "I'm showing priority alerts from the Trade Consortium negotiations. Please tell me this is about scheduling conflict and not ceremonial insults." "Both, unfortunately," came the response from Night Shift Coordinator Martinez, her voice carrying the kind of exhaustion that made military deployment seem relaxing. "The Asterian Trade Consortium is threatening to withdraw from refugee settlement negotiations unless we can resolve apparent discrepancies in the humanitarian aid protocols." Discrepancies meaning what exactly? Meaning human and Asterian interpretations of emergency evacuation authority appear to be completely incompatible, and Queen Seraphina is requesting immediate consultation with someone who understands both species' legal frameworks. Thomas grabbed his emergency diplomatic kit and headed for the Citadel's central court chambers, navigating through corridors that combined elegant Asterian architecture with the kind of practical space station engineering that kept everyone breathing in the vacuum of deep space. The result looked like someone had built a palace inside a starship, which was exactly what had happened when the Asterians decided that permanent diplomatic facilities were more effective than traditional embassy shuttles. The Asterian Royal Citadel existed as both seat of government and diplomatic neutral ground, where representatives from dozens of species could interact according to protocols that had been refined over millennia of interstellar negotiations. Queen Seraphina Velthari ruled from chambers that could accommodate beings whose biology ranged from aquatic to crystalline, while maintaining the kind of ancient dignity that made younger civilizations feel both welcomed and properly humble. "Commander Reed," announced Elder Kesvar as Thomas entered the consultation chamber, his ceremonial robes marking him as the court's primary legal authority. "Queen Seraphina requires immediate clarification regarding human colonial evacuation protocols." Thomas bowed appropriately, a skill that had taken months to master, given that inappropriate bowing could be interpreted as either marriage proposals or challenges to ritual combat, depending on the specific angle and duration. "Your Majesty, Elder Kesvar, how can I assist with the legal clarifications?" Queen Seraphina looked up from holographic displays that showed the scope of the current crisis, her violet eyes reflecting the kind of exhaustion that came from bearing responsibility for entire civilizations. "Commander Reed, human authorities are claiming that emergency evacuation protocols require species-specific authorization. Our laws specify that evacuation assistance must be provided to any beings in distress, regardless of political or biological classification. A fundamental incompatibility that threatens to invalidate the entire humanitarian framework we've been negotiating for 6 months," Elder Kesvar added grimly. "Without resolution, the refugee populations currently stranded in conflict zones will remain trapped while legal authorities debate evacuation criteria." Thomas studied the displays, recognizing patterns from his diplomatic training that suggested the problem wasn't really about legal frameworks, but about entities that profited from keeping refugee populations trapped in exploitable situations. "Your Majesty, with respect, I think we're looking at a manufactured crisis. Human evacuation protocols are designed to be flexible specifically to accommodate interspecies humanitarian requirements. Someone's been feeding incompatible interpretations to both sides to create artificial legal barriers. You believe this is deliberate sabotage of the negotiations?" I believe someone profits from keeping refugee populations stranded, and they're using legal complexity to prevent evacuation assistance that would interfere with their operations. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of emergency consultations, legal research, and diplomatic crisis management that required Thomas to maintain almost constant availability for Queen Seraphina's questions about human legal precedents and cultural interpretations. The Asterian court operated on extended day-night cycles that allowed for marathon negotiation sessions. But human biology wasn't designed for the kind of schedule that had him sleeping in brief intervals between emergency consultations. "Commander Reed," Queen Seraphina said during one of their late-night sessions reviewing legal precedents, "I fear this crisis is more complex than simple administrative disagreements. The pattern suggests systematic manipulation of both our legal systems." Agreed, and the timing of these discrepancies always seems to coincide with moments when we're close to breakthrough agreements. Thomas rubbed his eyes, fatigue making it difficult to focus on the holographic legal texts floating around them. Someone's been very carefully studying our negotiation processes to identify exactly when to introduce complications. The question is whether we can identify the source of manipulation before the refugee situations become critical. Thomas noticed that Queen Seraphina looked as exhausted as he felt, her usual regal composure showing signs of strain that came from maintaining diplomatic dignity while dealing with crises that affected millions of lives. Despite the formal protocols that governed their interactions, he developed genuine respect for her wisdom and dedication to her people's welfare. "Your Majesty, when did you last get actual rest? Not meditation sessions between meetings, but genuine sleep. When did you last get rest that wasn't interrupted by emergency consultations?" Queen Seraphina replied with a slight smile that made her seem less like ancient royalty and more like someone carrying impossible responsibilities with grace and determination. "Point taken. Though I have to say, if we keep maintaining this schedule, we're going to start making diplomatic errors that create the kind of incidents we're trying to prevent." "The refuge cannot wait for our convenience, Commander Reed. Every day we delay means more families trapped in situations where their only options are exploitation or death." As they worked through another night of legal research and protocol clarification, Thomas found himself increasingly impressed by Queen Seraphina's combination of royal authority and genuine compassion. Her understanding of interstellar law was sophisticated enough to find solutions that human diplomats had missed, while her concern for refugee welfare remained personal rather than simply political. "Your Majesty," Thomas said as they concluded another marathon session around dawn station time, "I think we've identified enough legal precedents to counter the artificial barriers. Though I suspect whoever's been manipulating the process will simply introduce new complications. Then we will address new complications as they arise. The alternative is accepting that humanitarian assistance should be subject to political convenience." Thomas nodded, though fatigue was making it difficult to maintain the kind of professional alertness that diplomatic protocol required. Around them, the citadel was beginning its daily cycles, but both he and Queen Seraphina looked like they needed rest more than they needed to maintain formal schedules. "Commander Reed, there are meditation chambers near the central court if you need quiet space for rest between consultations. The negotiations will likely require your availability again within a few hours." "Thank you, Your Majesty. Though I suspect you need rest as much as I do." "Perhaps we both do." As Thomas made his way to one of the Citadel's quiet meditation chambers, he reflected that serving as cultural liaison had proven more demanding than military deployment, but also more rewarding than any previous assignment. Working with Queen Seraphina to navigate the complexity of interspecies humanitarian law was challenging enough to require all his diplomatic training while serving purposes that felt genuinely important. He had no way of knowing that his exhausted collapse in the meditation chamber would soon be joined by an equally exhausted queen, whose presence during vulnerable moments would activate ancient Asterian bonding protocols that neither of them understood well enough to anticipate. Sometimes the most significant relationships begin in moments of shared vulnerability, and Thomas Reed was about to discover that sleeping in proximity to alien royalty could reshape his understanding of duty, responsibility, and the unexpected ways that finding comfort in someone's presence could transform the political balance between entire civilizations. Thomas awakened slowly, his mind registering comfort and warmth before his diplomatic training reminded him that he was supposed to be alone in the Citadel's meditation chamber. The realization that he was definitely not alone came gradually, followed immediately by the much more alarming realization that Queen Seraphina was sleeping peacefully in his arms, her head resting on his shoulder while they lay together on the chamber's meditation platform. For a moment, Thomas remained perfectly still, trying to process the situation without moving enough to wake her. Queen Seraphina looked younger in sleep, her royal composure replaced by the kind of peaceful expression that made her seem more like a tired person seeking comfort than an ancient ruler bearing the weight of interstellar politics. The diplomatic implications hit him like a collision with space debris, intimate proximity with alien royalty, potential violation of cultural protocols he didn't understand, possible career-ending scandal that could damage relations between two civilizations. Oh, this is either the best sleep I've had in months, or the worst diplomatic crisis of my career, Thomas murmured quietly, trying to determine how to extricate himself without waking Queen Seraphina or creating an incident that would require explanations he couldn't provide. Both, I suspect, came Queen Seraphina's voice, soft but alert, suggesting she'd been awake longer than he'd realized. Though the diplomatic crisis may be considerably more complex than simple protocol violation. Thomas felt his heart stop as Queen Seraphina lifted her head to look at him, her violet eyes wide with what appeared to be shock mixed with something that might have been terror. "Your Majesty, I am profoundly sorry for any impropriety. I must have fallen asleep, and if I inadvertently—" "Commander Reed," Queen Seraphina interrupted gently, "you did nothing improper. We were both exhausted, we both sought the same quiet space for rest, and we apparently found." She paused, searching for words, comfort in each other's presence during sleep. That sounds like it should be a good thing, rather than a diplomatic crisis. In most cultures it would be. In Asterian culture it is, legally significant. Queen Seraphina sat up slowly, though she remained close enough that Thomas could see the subtle luminescence that marked her as noble bloodline. "Commander Reed, are you familiar with the concept of Velnathi solace?" "I've encountered references in cultural briefings, but the specifics weren't covered in liaison training." Velnathi solace is an ancient bonding ritual that establishes permanent legal connections between participants who share intimate proximity during sleep. Queen Seraphina's voice carried the weight of cultural tradition mixed with personal concern. It was designed to ensure that physical intimacy always carries emotional and legal consequences, preventing political marriages of convenience. Thomas felt pieces clicking together in his mind with the kind of clarity that usually preceded very bad news. "Your Majesty, are you telling me that sleeping next to you has created some sort of marriage bond?" "Consort witness bond, technically, which grants you legal standing within the royal family and access to dynastic protocols that could influence the balance of power throughout the Asterian Empire. But we didn't. That is, we were just sleeping, fully clothed, completely appropriate, just two tired people sharing space. The Velnathi solace is not about sexual intimacy," Queen Seraphina explained patiently. "It is about emotional vulnerability and the trust required to sleep peacefully in someone's presence. According to our laws, such trust indicates readiness for permanent partnership." Thomas stared at her, trying to process information that made diplomatic protocol seem like a relaxing hobby. And this bond is permanent, irrevocable under Asterian law, a safeguard designed to prevent manipulation of royal authority through temporary alliances. Queen Seraphina's expression mixed resignation with something that might have been hope. Commander Reed, I am deeply sorry for the complications this will create in your life. I should have considered the possibility when we both sought rest in the same chamber. Your Majesty, you had no more reason to expect this than I did. We were both exhausted, we both needed quiet space, and neither of us intended to activate ancient bonding rituals. Thomas paused, considering the implications. What exactly does consort witness status involve in practical terms? Shared authority over certain royal decisions, access to dynastic command codes, and legal responsibility for the welfare of the Asterian people. Queen Seraphina activated a holographic display that showed the scope of systems now accessible through their bonded biometrics, including command authority over refugee evacuation networks that span multiple star systems. Refugee evacuation networks, Thomas repeated, understanding suddenly dawning. The same networks that have been blocked by the legal complications we've been trying to resolve. Exactly. The Velnathi Solace has granted us combined authority to activate ancient Asterian protocols that could provide immediate evacuation assistance, bypassing the artificial legal barriers that have been preventing humanitarian aid. Thomas looked at the displays showing stranded refugee populations, understanding that their accidental bonding had inadvertently solved the crisis they'd been working to address for months. So our sleeping arrangement has given us the authority to help millions of displaced people. Yes, but it has also made us targets for the same entities that have been manipulating the legal frameworks to prevent evacuation assistance. Queen Seraphina's expression grew serious. Corporate and military interests that profit from keeping refugee populations trapped in exploitable situations will not hesitate to eliminate two individuals who threaten their entire operation. A soft chime indicated incoming priority communications. Elder Kesvar's voice echoed through the meditation chamber's communication system, carrying formal tones that suggested he was speaking for official records. Your Majesty, representatives from multiple factions are requesting immediate audience regarding the bonding situation. That has apparently occurred. Human authorities are claiming treaty violations, while certain Asterian court members are demanding clarification of succession implications. Elder Kesvar, Queen Seraphina replied formally, please inform all parties that the Velnathi Solace is recognized under ancient law and cannot be dissolved through external pressure. Any discussions regarding its implications will be conducted according to proper diplomatic protocol. Your Majesty, with respect, the human corporate representative is claiming that Commander Reed's bond constitutes unauthorized political alliance that threatens human colonial independence. Thomas felt anger kindle in his chest at the suggestion that his accidental bonding was somehow treasonous. Elder Kesvar, please inform the corporate representative that I maintain my human citizenship and my loyalty to humanitarian principles, regardless of any legal bonds that may have been created through cultural exchange. Very diplomatically stated, Queen Seraphina said with approval, though I fear the political implications are only beginning to develop. As they prepared to face the diplomatic storm that their shared sleep had created, Thomas reflected that his cultural liaison career had never covered scenarios where personal comfort could reshape interstellar politics. But looking at Queen Seraphina, seeing determination mixed with vulnerability in her expression, he realized that some responsibilities were worth accepting, regardless of the complications they created. He was beginning to suspect that this would either be the most important mistake of his diplomatic career or the most accidental act of humanitarian heroism in human history. Possibly both. The emergency session of the Asterian Royal Council convened in a chamber designed for crisis management, where holographic displays showed real-time intelligence about the multiple factions now mobilizing in response to news of the Velnathi Solace bond. Thomas sat beside Queen Seraphina at the Central Council table, trying to process information that made interstellar diplomacy seem like a peaceful retirement activity. Commander Reed, Elder Kesvar began, consulting legal databases that floated around him like luminous butterflies. Your bonding with Queen Seraphina has created unprecedented legal complications. Human corporate representatives are claiming that your consort witness status constitutes unauthorized alien political alliance. Unauthorized by whom? Thomas asked, noting that Queen Seraphina remained remarkably composed for someone whose accidental sleeping arrangement had apparently triggered multiple international incidents. I maintain my human citizenship and my commitment to humanitarian principles. Last I checked, forming personal relationships wasn't subject to corporate approval. Director Walsh from Earth Colonial Resource Management is claiming that your access to Asterian dynastic protocols represents a security breach that threatens human independence, Elder Kesvar continued. Meanwhile, certain Asterian traditionalists are demanding that the bond be dissolved rather than allow human contamination of royal succession. Contamination, Thomas repeated, feeling his diplomatic training clash with personal irritation. I see that bigotry transcends species barriers. Queen Seraphina activated displays that showed the true scope of their situation. The Velnathi Solace has granted us combined access to evacuation network controls that certain entities have been trying to prevent us from using. Our bonding threatens their ability to maintain profitable refugee exploitation. Profitable how? Stranded refugee populations provide exploitable labor for corporate operations that profit from desperation, Queen Seraphina explained, highlighting intelligence reports that painted a disturbing picture. Artificial legal barriers prevent evacuation assistance, forcing displaced families to accept whatever employment they can find, regardless of conditions or compensation. Thomas studied the data, recognizing economic warfare patterns from his diplomatic training. Someone's been deliberately creating legal complications to prevent refugee assistance, maintaining captive labor pools for corporate exploitation. Multiple someones from both species, Elder Kesvar confirmed. Human corporate interests coordinating with Asterian military contractors to ensure that evacuation protocols remain inaccessible while publicly supporting humanitarian aid. A priority communication alert interrupted their analysis. Director Walsh's image materialized in the council chamber, her expression suggesting she was dealing with what she considered an act of treason requiring immediate correction. Commander Reed, you will dissolve this alien political alliance immediately and report for debriefing regarding your unauthorized access to foreign government systems. Director Walsh, Thomas replied carefully, I have not formed any political alliances. I have formed a personal bond that happens to carry legal implications under Asterian law. Personal bonds that grant access to alien military systems constitute security breaches regardless of your intentions. You will submit to extraction and classification review. Extraction. Queen Seraphina's voice carried harmonics that made the chamber's crystalline walls resonate. Director Walsh, Commander Reed is under the protection of Asterian diplomatic immunity. Any attempt to remove him from this facility will be considered an act of war. Your Majesty, with respect, Commander Reed is a human citizen whose security clearances have been compromised by foreign influence. We have jurisdiction over our own personnel. Thomas felt something shift in his awareness, enhanced perception that let him recognize the tactical situation developing around the Citadel. Director Walsh, I notice you've positioned military assets around the royal facility. That suggests this conversation isn't really about security review. That suggests, Queen Seraphina added, accessing intelligence networks through their shared bond, that Director Walsh represents interests that view our combined authority over evacuation protocols as a threat to their operations. The displays updated to show corporate security forces taking positions around the Citadel, while intercepted communications revealed coordination with Asterian separatist factions, who wanted to prevent any human involvement in royal authority. They're not here to extract me for debriefing, Thomas realized, processing tactical intelligence through their bonded awareness. They're here to eliminate both of us before we can activate evacuation protocols that would interfere with their refugee exploitation operations. Director Walsh, Queen Seraphina said formally, you have 30 minutes to withdraw your forces from Asterian sovereign territory before defensive protocols are activated. Your Majesty, we are prepared to use necessary force to prevent security breaches that threaten both our species' interests. Whose interests? Thomas asked, feeling anger override diplomatic caution. The interests of entities that profit from keeping refugee families trapped in exploitation situations, or the interests of people who believe humanitarian assistance should serve those who need help rather than those who profit from and if we don't use it, then the artificial legal barriers remain in place. Refugee families continue to suffer in exploitation situations, and the entities manipulating both our legal systems continue to profit from humanitarian crises they help create. Thomas looked around the council chamber at faces representing one of the galaxy's oldest civilizations, seeing determination mixed with the kind of professional concern that came with making decisions where failure meant not just personal consequences, but continued suffering for millions of beings whose only crime was needing safe places to raise their families. Your Majesty, he said quietly, I became a cultural liaison because I believed that understanding between species could prevent the kind of conflicts that create refugee crises in the first place. But maybe preventing those crises isn't enough if we don't also have the courage to help people when prevention fails. You're willing to accept permanent consort witness status, knowing that it will make you a target for forces that view our bond as a threat to their operations. I'm willing to accept responsibility for using whatever authority we have to help people who need help, regardless of the personal consequences. Queen Seraphina's expression mixed relief with determination as she realized he was agreeing to formalize their bond. Then we need to complete the Vel Nathi Solace ceremony before the assault forces can prevent us from accessing the evacuation networks. How long does the ceremony take? 20 minutes for the full formal ritual, assuming we can reach the sacred chambers before corporate security breaches the Citadel's outer defenses. And how long before they breach those defenses? Approximately 15 minutes, based on current assault patterns. Thomas activated his emergency diplomatic protocols, preparing for the most important ceremony of his career, while corporate armies and separatist forces attempted to prevent humanitarian assistance from reaching people who had been trapped by artificial legal barriers designed to serve profit margins rather than human welfare. Your Majesty, he said, standing to accompany her to the sacred chambers, I think it's time to find out whether accidentally sleeping next to alien royalty was the best mistake I've ever made, or just the most complicated. Both, Queen Seraphina replied with a smile that suggested she was equally terrified and determined, though I suspect the complications are about to become significantly more dramatic. As they moved toward the Citadel's most protected ceremonial spaces, while defense systems prepared to repel assault forces, Thomas reflected that his diplomatic career had taught him to build bridges between cultures, but the Vel Nathi Solace was about to teach him to build sanctuaries that transcended political boundaries. He was beginning to suspect that this would either be the most important diplomatic achievement of his lifetime, or the most spectacular failure of judgment in interstellar relations. The sacred chamber of the Asterian royal citadel had been designed for ceremonies that could determine the fate of entire civilizations, which turned out to be remarkably appropriate for formalizing accidental sleep bonding, while corporate armies attempted to prevent humanitarian assistance from reaching refugee populations. Thomas knelt beside Queen Seraphina before an altar that seemed to pulse with organic light, while above them, defensive systems repelled assault forces that wanted to capture or eliminate them before they could activate evacuation networks. "Are you certain about this?" Queen Seraphina asked, her voice carrying the formal harmonics required for Asterian ceremonies, while her eyes reflected very personal stakes about trusting her people's future to someone she'd known for 8 months. Because the full Velnathi solace creates permanent biological and legal connections that will affect every decision you make for the rest of your extended lifespan. Extended lifespan? Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Asterian longevity transfers through formal bonding. You'll live for centuries, during which you'll share responsibility for governing an empire that spans dozens of star systems. Centuries of royal responsibility and interstellar diplomacy, Thomas said, attempting to maintain some levity in a situation that felt like standing at the crossroads of galactic history. "Well, I always wondered what I'd do after retirement from the diplomatic corps. The reality involves considerably more ceremonial obligations and considerably less personal freedom than human retirement planning typically includes," Queen Seraphina assured him, activating crystalline apparatus that would formalize their legal and biological connection, though the defensive capabilities should make up for some of the lifestyle restrictions. Defensive capabilities: enhanced strength, speed, and tactical awareness sufficient to protect evacuation networks against corporate security forces and military contractors who profit from refugee exploitation. Queen Seraphina prepared ceremonial implements that appeared to be designed for permanent biological modification, plus access to command authorities that span multiple star systems. Elder Kesvar began the ceremonial incantations, his voice harmonizing with the chamber's resonance fields, while defensive systems continued repelling assault attempts above them. "Do you, Queen Seraphina Velthari, accept the full bond of Velnathi solace with Thomas Reed, knowing that this choice will intertwine your fates across all challenges to come?" "I do," Queen Seraphina said, her voice steady despite the sounds of combat echoing through the citadel's upper levels. "And I promise to honor his humanity while granting him authority over Asterian resources, to support his decisions regarding refugee assistance, and to never use our bond for political advantage that would compromise his principles or our people's welfare." "And do you, Thomas Reed, accept the bond of Velnathi solace with Queen Seraphina Velthari, understanding that you accept not just personal partnership, but responsibility for the welfare of millions of beings across dozens of worlds?" Thomas looked into Queen Seraphina's violet eyes, seeing determination mixed with vulnerability and trust that went beyond anything he'd experienced in his diplomatic career. "I do. And I promise to honor Asterian traditions while maintaining my commitment to humanitarian principles, to use our shared authority to serve those who need protection rather than those who profit from their suffering, and to never forget that the most important diplomatic achievements are measured in lives saved rather than treaties signed." The chamber filled with harmonics as quantum resonance fields activated, creating biological and legal bonds that transcended species barriers. Thomas felt reality shift around him as Queen Seraphina's consciousness touched his own, not invasive, but like gaining access to awareness he hadn't known existed. Knowledge flowed between them, her memories of ruling with the weight of ancient responsibility, his experiences building bridges between cultures whose differences had seemed insurmountable. Her understanding of interstellar politics merged with his practical knowledge of humanitarian logistics, creating shared perspective that neither could have achieved alone. But more than expanded awareness, he felt fundamental changes in his biology, enhanced capabilities that would allow him to coordinate evacuation operations across vast distances, improved physical resilience that would be essential for someone whose responsibilities might span centuries, and direct access to command systems that had been waiting for exactly this kind of authorization. The ceremony's completion triggered automatic activation of the Asterian evacuation networks throughout the frontier sectors. Ancient transportation systems came online that could move refugee populations to safety faster than corporate forces could coordinate suppression efforts, while communication networks broadcast the conspiracy evidence to every major oversight body in both civilizations. "Warning," announced the chamber's ancient AI, speaking in harmonics that predated human spaceflight. "Evacuation network activation detected by hostile monitoring systems. Corporate assault forces attempting final breach of ceremonial chambers." "Let them come," Thomas said, feeling abilities he was still learning to control. "They came here expecting to capture or eliminate two isolated individuals. Instead, they're facing consort witnesses with access to defensive systems that were designed to protect refugee networks against exactly this kind of exploitation attempt." The final confrontation was brief and decisive. Corporate security forces found themselves facing not just enhanced Asterian capabilities, but automated defensive systems that had been specifically designed to protect humanitarian operations against military interference. Their weapons malfunctioned, their communications were jammed, and their extraction equipment was systematically disabled by technologies that treated corporate profit margins as irrelevant to refugee protection protocols. "This is impossible," Director Walsh's voice crackled through damaged communication equipment as her forces retreated in disorder. "No individual bond should have this level of defensive authority." "Director Walsh," Thomas replied, his voice now carrying harmonics that resonated through the evacuation network's communication systems. "You're not dealing with individual authority anymore. You're dealing with consort witnesses who have access to systems designed to ensure that humanitarian assistance serves people rather than profit margins." The conspiracy's exposure triggered investigations throughout both civilizations, revealing the scope of coordination between corporate and military entities that had been systematically preventing refugee assistance while maintaining exploitable labor pools. The evacuation networks, once activated, operated autonomously to transport displaced populations to safety while broadcasting evidence that made suppression impossible. 6 months later, consort witness Thomas Reed Velthari stood in the Citadel's Coordination Center, reviewing evac. 6 months later, consort witness Thomas Reed Velthari stood in the Citadel's Coordination Center, reviewing evacuation statistics that showed the scope of what their accidental bonding had accomplished. The hyphenated name had been his suggestion, representing the new form of existence they'd created together. Neither purely human nor traditionally Asterian, but something designed specifically to serve humanitarian networks that transcended political boundaries. The Velnathi Solace had evolved beyond its original purpose, becoming less about royal succession and more about shared responsibility for ensuring that ancient promises of sanctuary remained available to anyone fleeing persecution, exploitation, or corporate control. Thomas's diplomatic experience had expanded to include coordination of refugee assistance across vast distances, while his enhanced capabilities allowed him to work tirelessly maintaining systems that ordinary human physiology couldn't sustain. "Any regrets?" Queen Seraphina asked, joining him at the coordination displays where transport routes showed constant movement of families reaching safety beyond the reach of corporate exploitation. "Well," Thomas said thoughtfully, I do miss being able to sleep without accidentally triggering ancient bonding rituals that reshape interstellar politics. There's something appealingly straightforward about diplomatic work that doesn't involve permanent biological modification and centuries-long lifespans. As opposed to as opposed to serving as immortal consort witness to alien royalty, while coordinating evacuation networks that span dozens of star systems, and maintaining diplomatic relationships with beings whose biology ranges from aquatic to crystalline. Thomas pulled her closer, marveling at how natural it felt to share consciousness with someone whose people he'd been trained to see as fundamentally alien just months ago. Though I have to say, the enhanced awareness has some unexpected benefits, such as being able to sense when you're about to suggest adding another star system to our evacuation network coverage, even before you've consciously decided to do it yourself. The enhanced diplomatic capabilities are quite useful, Queen Seraphina confirmed through their mental connection. Though your tendency to dream about Earth botanical gardens is occasionally distracting during formal court proceedings. That's what you get for bonding with someone whose subconscious is still processing the transition from quiet liaison work to galactic humanitarian coordination. And your thoughts during the Centauri trade negotiations were much more interesting than the actual discussion of mineral rights allocation. Which thoughts specifically? The ones where you were calculating how many refugee families could be transported, using the shipping capacity they were arguing about for luxury goods distribution. Thomas grinned, feeling the familiar satisfaction that came with using his enhanced diplomatic skills for purposes that actually mattered. Well, someone has to keep our priorities straight. It's easy to get distracted by political complexity when the real question is always, how many people can we help? As they stood together watching the impossible vista of dozens of star systems learning to cooperate instead of competing for exploitable labor pools, Thomas reflected on the strange turns his liaison career had taken. He'd started as a diplomat trained to build bridges between cultures, but the Velnathi solace had taught him to build sanctuaries that transcended political boundaries. The conspiracy they'd exposed had been completely dismantled, its architects facing justice, while the artificial barriers they'd maintained gave way to genuine cooperation. Evacuation networks now operated as permanent infrastructure, using combined human and Asterian resources to provide assistance that neither species could have managed alone. "There's something I should tell you," Queen Seraphina said, her mental voice carrying harmonics of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. "I'm listening." The Velnathi solace, it's not just about our bond. According to the ancient texts, consort witness pairs who achieve true harmony can activate dormant protocols in other species' humanitarian networks, creating connections that span the entire galaxy. Thomas considered this revelation. So not only did we accidentally become the most important diplomatic couple in Asterian history, we might also be able to help activate similar evacuation networks maintained by other civilizations. Essentially, yes. The networks were designed to work together, but they've been dormant for millennia because no one had the authority to coordinate activation across species barriers. "No pressure at all," Thomas said with a grin. "Just the responsibility for potentially activating a galaxy-spanning refugee assistance network that could help displaced populations throughout known space. We could start with the Centauri emergency protocols," Queen Seraphina suggested helpfully. "They've been asking for assistance with volcanic evacuation procedures on 3 of their mining worlds. Volcanic evacuation coordination, galactic humanitarian networks, centuries-long diplomatic partnerships with alien royalty." Thomas nodded slowly. "You know, 6 months ago I would have asked whether you were serious. Now I'm just wondering whether we need to pack special equipment for coordinating with beings whose idea of emergency assistance involves manipulating stellar radiation patterns." The Centauri are quite practical, actually, and they have excellent disaster response protocols. I think you'll appreciate their approach to large-scale population movement. Will there be more chances for me to accidentally reshape galactic politics through routine personal choices? Almost certainly. Perfect. I was getting bored with normal diplomatic crises that only affected individual star systems. As the Asterian Royal Citadel continued its orbit carrying them toward their next coordination mission, Thomas Reed Velthari, former cultural liaison, current consort witness, and the man who'd learned that sometimes the most important diplomatic breakthroughs happen when you find comfort in someone's presence, without realizing that sharing solace can activate ancient protocols that reshape the balance of power between entire civilizations, settled back to watch the stars wheel in patterns that their shared consciousness could appreciate in ways neither species could achieve alone. He'd always been good at building bridges between cultures. He just never imagined that his most important bridge would be built during sleep, creating connections that literally transcended the boundaries between individual consciousness and collective responsibility. The Velnathi solace had taught him that the most effective diplomacy wasn't about negotiating between separate interests, but about recognizing that all consciousness was ultimately connected, and that the most important agreements were the ones that served everyone who needed protection from forces too large for individuals to face alone. Serafina, he said, watching another transport full of refugees emerge safely from hyperspace, I think this might be the most important diplomatic mission I've ever had the privilege to accept. Even though it's considerably more complex than standard cultural liaison work. Especially because it's more complex. The best diplomatic solutions are the ones that serve the greatest number of people, regardless of what species they started as or what political boundaries they need to cross to reach safety. And even though it began completely by accident, maybe the best relationships do begin by accident. When you're not trying to create something politically useful, you're more likely to create something genuinely meaningful. As they traveled toward their next humanitarian coordination